Chapter 5, Exile in Brussels. 1. The German ideology. Driven out of France, Marx went with his family to Brussels. Engels feared that in the end the authorities would make trouble for him in Belgium also, and in fact the trouble came immediately. In a letter to Heine, Marx writes that immediately after his arrival in Brussels he was summoned to the Administration de la Sûreté Publique to sign an undertaking not to print anything concerning current Belgian politics. He agreed to this with an easy conscience, for he had neither the intention nor the possibility of doing anything of the kind. But as the Prussian government continued to importune the Belgian authorities with demands for his expulsion, Marx formally abandoned Prussian citizenship in the same year, on the 1st of December, 1845. Neither at that time nor at any subsequent period did he seek citizenship in any other country. Although in the spring of 1848 the provisional government of the French Republic offered him French citizenship in a fashion which did him all honor, like Heine, Marx was unable to make up his mind to such a course, though Freiligrath, who was so often played off against them as a German to the core and the brilliant antithesis of the two vagabonds without a fatherland, saw no objection at all to taking out naturalization papers during his exile in England. In the spring of 1845, Engels arrived in Brussels, and the two friends then went together to England for the purposes of study and stayed there for 6 weeks. Whilst he was in Paris, Marx had begun to occupy himself with McCulloch and Ricardo, and during this visit to England he was able to take a deeper look into the economic literature of the island kingdom. Although for the moment he saw only those books obtainable in Manchester and the extracts and writings in Engels' possession. During his first stay in England Engels had contributed to the New Moral World, the organ of Owen, and to the Northern Star, the organ of the Chartists. And he now renewed old friendships, and together the two friends established many new contacts with the Chartists and Socialists. When they returned from this journey they began a new joint work. We decided, as Marx observed laconically later, to work out our own standpoint together as against the opinions and the ideology of German philosophy, in fact, to settle accounts with our former philosophic conscience. We did this in the form of a criticism of post-Hegelian philosophy. The manuscript, 2 big octave volumes, was already in the hands of a Westphalian publisher when we were informed that altered circumstances rendered publication impossible. Whereupon we abandoned our manuscript to the gnawing criticism of the mice. We did so with little regret, because our main object had been achieved. We had come to an understanding with ourselves. As a matter of fact, the mice really did get at the manuscript, but its remnants are sufficient to explain to us why its authors were not all too depressed at the misfortune. Their thorough, even all too thorough, settlement of accounts with Bruno Bauer proved a hard nut for their readers to crack, and the 2 big volumes, comprising together about 800 pages, would have been a still harder one. The title of the work was The German Ideology, a criticism of recent German philosophy and its representatives Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, and Stirner, and a criticism of German socialism and its various prophets. Speaking from memory, Engels declared later that the criticism of Stirner was no less voluminous than Stirner's own book. And the examples which have since been published indicate that Engels' memory was thoroughly reliable. The work is a still more discursive super-polemic than the Holy Family even in its most arid chapters, and the oases in the desert are still more rare, though they are by no means entirely absent. Whilst even when dialectical trenchancy does show itself it soon degenerates into hair-splitting and quibbling, some of it of a rather puerile character. It is true that our taste in these matters is more fastidious today, but that alone is not sufficient explanation, particularly as both Marx and Engels had shown before and have shown since, and showed even at the same time, that they were capable of epigrammatically trenchant criticism and that their style suffered little from prolixity. The decisive factor was that these intellectual struggles took place in a very small circle and most of the combatants were very young. It was the same phenomenon that literary history has observed in Shakespeare and his dramatic contemporaries, a tendency to ride a turn of speech to the death, to give the statements of their opponents as foolish a meaning as possible by literal interpretation or misrepresentation. A tendency to exaggeration and recklessness of expression, all that was not meant for the general public but for the esoteric understanding of the fellow expert. Much that is indigestible or even ununderstandable in Shakespeare's humor today can be explained by the fact that, consciously or unconsciously, He was influenced in his work by considerations of what Green and Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Beaumont and Fletcher would think about it. Something of the sort is probably the explanation of the tone which Marx and Engels consciously or unconsciously adopted when dealing with Bauer and Stirner and other of their old companions in the art of purely intellectual gymnastics. What they had to say about Feuerbach would have been much more interesting because it would have been something more than purely negative criticism. But unfortunately this part of the work was never completed. Fairly clear indications of their attitude are given in one or two aphorisms about Feuerbach jotted down by Marx in 1845 and published a few decades later by Engels. Marx complained chiefly that Feuerbach's materialism lacked an energizing principle, just as he had complained in the same way in his student days about Democritus. This, he declared, was the chief weakness of all previous materialism, the appreciation of the thing, the reality, the sensuality, only in the form of the object or the idea, and not subjectively, not in practice, not in human sensuous activity. In consequence the active side had been developed by idealism as against materialism, but abstractly only, for naturally idealism knew no real sensuous activity. In other words, when Feuerbach abandoned the whole of Hegel he had abandoned too much. It was, in fact, necessary to transfer Hegel's revolutionizing dialectics from the realm of thought to the realm of reality. Whilst still in Barmen Engels had written audaciously to Feuerbach in order to win him for communism and the latter had answered in a friendly tone, but, for the moment at least, in the negative. Feuerbach expected to go to the Rhineland in the summer and Engels was planning to drum it into him that he must go on to Brussels. In the meantime he sent Hermann Krieger, a pupil of Feuerbach, to Marx, describing him as a splendid agitator. However, Feuerbach did not go to the Rhineland and his subsequent works showed that it was too late for him to discard his old shell. His pupil Krieger also failed to come up to the mark. He did carry communist propaganda over the Atlantic, but he caused irreparable mischief in New York and it reacted ruinously on the communist colony which Marx had begun to gather around him in Brussels.